She sat down in the middle of Main Street, in her good dress, in the red dust, in front of everyone. Not because she fell, because standing no longer seemed like something worth doing after the man she loved looked her in the eye and told her she was not enough. She had no idea that the wagon that stopped beside her was not stopping to help her up. It was stopping to take her exactly where she was always meant to go. But before she could find that she would have to survive what came next, a dead woman's secret, a child who had not spoken in 4 years, and a man with enough money to bury the truth forever. This is the story of Sarah Calloway, and what happened when she stopped running from what she was and walked straight into what she deserved. This channel is home to stories of the American frontier, where love is earned in dust and silence, where mothers and daughters find each other across the impossible, and where the most ordinary acts of human kindness turn out to be the ones that save us. If you believe that a person's worth has nothing to do with what others decide, it is this story was made for you. Stay until the end. Leave a comment with where you are watching from. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if stories like this are what you come here for, subscribe so you never miss the next one.
I knew before he said it. That is the thing I have never admitted to anyone, not even to myself until much later, standing in a kitchen 4 miles west of town with flour on my hands and someone else's daughter pressed against my side. I knew the moment Clifton Marsh asked me to come into his office and close the door behind me with that particular careful click of a man who has rehearsed what comes next. His office smelled like leather and wood polish and the specific cologne he ordered from a catalog in Dallas. The desk was too large for an honest man. He had arranged 2 chairs facing each other, which was unusual. Clifton preferred to speak from behind the desk, where the size of it could do some of the talking for him. He gestured to the chair across from him. He smiled. The smile was the second sign that something was wrong. Clifton was not a man who smiled without a reason. I sat down. I folded my hands in my lap. I waited. He said he had spoken with Dr. Hensley. He said he understood now that there were certain expectations of marriage that I would be unable to fulfill. He said he was sorry. He used the word sorry 4 times in approximately 2 minutes, which told me everything I needed to know about how much he meant it. A man who is truly sorry says it once and means it. A man who says it 4 times is building a record. He did not say the word he was thinking, the word Dr. Hensley had used in his office 3 weeks earlier while his hands were folded and his voice was gentle and clinical in the same breath. He dressed it in careful language, certain expectations, unable to fulfill. He was too polished to say the word out loud. He did not need to. It had been sitting in my chest like a stone since the doctor's office. Barren. There it is. I can say it now. I could not say it then. I thanked Clifton for his honesty. I stood up. I walked out of his office, through the front door of his building, and into the full summer heat of Sulphur Creek's Main Street. I made it to the center of the road before my legs stopped cooperating. I did not fall. I want to be clear about that. I sat down, deliberately, in the red dust of Main Street in my good dress with people watching from both sides of the street, and I simply sat because standing no longer seemed like something I was capable of organizing. My hands were in my lap. The engagement ring Clifton had given me 6 months ago was still on my finger. I looked at it. I thought in a very clear and quiet part of my mind that I should take it off. I could not make my fingers do it. I was aware of being looked at. I did not move. From the direction of the dry goods store, I heard a woman's voice say something to another woman. The words were not important. The tone was. That particular tone that people use when they feel sorry for you and relieved it is not them in equal measure. I heard every word. I was meant to hear every word. A shadow fell across me. Not the shadow of anyone I recognized. A hand positioned to block the sun from my eyes without touching me. A voice, low, unhurried, not alarmed, not pitying, not performing concern for the benefit of anyone watching. "Ma'am, you need a hand up or you need a minute?" I looked up. The sun was directly behind him. I could not see his face. Only the shape of a man who had asked a question and was in absolutely no rush for the answer. I had never in my life been asked that question. Whether I needed a hand up or a minute, as though both were equally acceptable, as though there was no wrong answer. I looked at the shape of him against the summer sky and said nothing for what felt like a long time. Then I said, "A minute." "All right," he said, and he waited. His name was Jesse Holt. I learned that after. What I knew first was the quality of his patience standing in the dust of Main Street while half of Sulphur Creek watched a woman sitting in the road and chose not to make it into anything it did not need to be. When I finally stood up, he offered his hand to help me to my feet. His grip was brief and practical. He released it the moment I was steady. He had a wagon, 2 children in the back. He said there was weather coming in off the flats, and the road west got dangerous after dark, and he was heading that direction anyway. I said I lived in town. He said his housekeeper made good coffee. I got in the wagon. I cannot entirely explain why. I think it was because he did not ask me anything. He did not ask what had happened or who the man was or why I had been sitting in the road. He simply made a practical statement about weather and coffee and let me make my own decision. The little girl in the wagon bed watched me the entire ride, dark-haired, solemn, watching with the fixed and uncomplicated attention of a child who has not yet learned that staring is impolite. She did not speak, not one word. The boy sat straight-backed and stared at the road ahead with the deliberate avoidance of someone who had decided not to be interested. The man beside me on the wagon seat said approximately 11 words the entire 4 miles. None of them wasted. The ranch came into view as the afternoon pushed into evening. A solid house, a working barn, land that sat easy under a man who actually worked it. The housekeeper was on the porch before the wagon stopped. A solid woman, somewhere past 60, gray hair pinned back, eyes that missed nothing. She looked at me from head to foot and back again with the efficiency of someone taking inventory. She said, "Red dust on that dress. Come into the kitchen." No greeting, no questions, just the kitchen. Her name was Agnes Pruitt, and I would come to understand that those 3 words told me everything about who she was. She did not waste time on preamble. She identified the situation, identified the immediate need, and addressed it. The kitchen was warm, coffee, cornbread, the particular smell of a room that has fed people for a long time. The little girl climbed into the chair next to mine. She did not speak. She did not touch me. She simply sat beside me with the calm certainty of a child who had made a decision and saw no reason to explain it. I looked at her small hand on the table next to mine. She did not know a single thing about me. She had sat down anyway. I did not know what to do with that. On the ride back to town at dusk, Jesse Holt asked me one question in the entire evening. "You got people here in Sulphur Creek?" I thought about it honestly. The answer was honest. "No," I said. He nodded once, filed it, said nothing more. That nod. It was not pity. It was not discomfort. It was the nod of a man making a note of something he intends to keep. I did not know what to make of it. I went back to my room above the dry goods store and sat on the edge of the bed and thought not about Clifton Marsh, not about Dr. Hensley's folded hands, not about the word I still could not say out loud. I thought about a little girl who had sat down beside a stranger like it was simply the sensible thing to do. My name is Sarah Calloway. I am 29 years old, and I am the daughter of William Calloway, who spent 30 years reading the land of Frio County. Like other men read books, walking property lines with a transit level and a notebook, translating the physical world into legal language that would hold up in court. He used to say that land records are honest in a way that people usually are not. Land does not lie about what it is. He died 8 months ago, which is why I am still in Sulphur Creek. I came to settle his affairs. I stayed because settling his affairs took longer than expected, and then I stayed because Clifton Marsh asked me to stay, and then I stayed because I did not know where else to go. Now I had one more reason to stay that I could not yet name. I went back to the Holt Ranch on Saturday. I told myself it was for the coffee. Agnes Pruitt did make excellent coffee. That was not why I went. Lily was sitting on the fence post at the end of the drive when I came up the road on Pete Granger's borrowed horse, legs dangling, watching the road, with the particular stillness of a child who was waiting for something and had decided it would come. When she saw me, she climbed down from the fence without hurrying, walked to the gate, took my hand, and led me inside. No words, no ceremony. She had made her decision about me on Tuesday, and as far as she was concerned, the matter was settled. Inside, Agnes looked at me over the rim of her cup, looked at Lily's hand in mine, and said nothing. But the coffee she set in front of me was the good cup, the one without the chip in the rim. Jesse came in from the yard and stopped when he saw me. Not dramatically, just a brief, complete stop, the way a person stops when something is slightly different than they expected, even though they knew it was coming. "Miss Calloway," he said. "Mr. Holt," I said. I held up the coffee cup slightly. "Agnes makes it better than anyone in town." "She knows it too," he said. "I do," Agnes said, not looking up. He pulled out the chair across from me, sat down, accepted the coffee Agnes put in front of him without asking. We looked at each other across the table with the slightly awkward formality of two people who have already established something without having agreed to. "I have a boundary dispute with the Voss property," he said finally. "I've been trying to get the survey records straight for 3 months. Your father did this county." "For 16 years, I said. "I know. Agnes told me." A pause. "Would you be willing to look at the records?" He was giving me a practical reason to be here. Something with clean edges that neither of us had to examine too closely. "I can do that," I said. Noah appeared in the kitchen doorway. 11 years old, straight-backed, his father's eyes in a younger face. He looked at me with the assessing steadiness of a boy who had learned to read situations the way his father read land. He did not say hello. He sat down at the far end of the table, opened a book, and did not look at me again. I noticed that he also did not leave. The survey maps were spread across the kitchen table by mid-morning. Jessie sat across from me, watching me work. Lily sat beside me, close enough that our arms touched, drawing in her notebook. Noah had moved to a closer chair without appearing to decide to. I read the maps the way my father taught me. Start at the established monuments. Trace the lines outward. Look for where the language breaks down, where one surveyor's notation disagrees with another's, where the dates tell a story the deed description doesn't. "Here," I said, pointing. "This watershed notation from 1869. Your father's deed references this survey directly. That means the water access is grandfathered under the original claim language." Jesse leaned across the table to look, close enough that I was aware of him in a way that had nothing to do with survey maps. "Voss has been arguing that the access road falls within his filing," he said. "It doesn't. Not if you read the 1869 notation correctly. He's counting on no one having the original survey." I looked up and found him looking at me instead of the map. "What?" "My father had those papers for 40 years, he said. "I've been through them twice. I didn't find that." "You knew what you were looking for," I said. "I know what words to listen for. My father taught me that land records tell stories. You have to know the language." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Where did you learn to read survey maps like that?" "The same place I learned to read. At my father's table, starting when I was about her age." I glanced at Lily, who was watching our conversation with quiet attention. She looked back down at her drawing immediately, as though she had not been listening. She had absolutely been listening. "Can I see what you're drawing?" I asked her. She considered this. Then she turned the notebook toward me. Horses. The house. A cat sitting on the porch that I had not seen yet but apparently existed. Agnes with her arms crossed, which was accurate. And one drawing set apart from the others, on a page by itself. A man I did not recognize, standing in darkness beside a horse. "Who is this?" I asked, keeping my voice the same way I kept it when I was asking about a survey notation I already suspected was significant. Lily looked at the drawing. She pointed at the figure. Then she pointed west through the kitchen wall in the direction of the Voss property. I looked at Jesse. He was reading the survey map and had not seen. That evening, after Jesse had gone back to the yard and Noah had taken himself outside, I found Agnes at the sink. I set Lily's notebook open to the drawing on the counter beside her. Agnes looked at it. The color left her face in a way that was immediate and complete, like a lamp being turned down. She picked up the notebook, closed it. "Don't ask about that night," she said. She left the kitchen. That night I lay in the room Agnes had prepared for me, the one with the blue curtains, and listened to the house settle around me. I thought about Lily's drawing, about the way Agnes's hands had moved when she picked up that notebook, about a little girl who had stopped speaking 4 years ago and had not yet started again. A knock at my door. Quiet. I sat up. Noah stood in the doorway, still dressed. He had been waiting for Agnes to go to bed. "You saw Lily's drawing," he said. "Yes." He studied me with that measuring look. Then he came in, sat in the chair by the window, and talked for the first time like a boy who had been carrying something alone for long enough. He told me what he knew, what he had seen and heard and pieced together over 4 years at 7 years old, then 8, then 9, carrying it because there was no one he could give it to without breaking his father. He talked for a long time. I listened. When he finished, he said, "I need to know what we're dealing with before I tell Papa. Can you find out?" I looked at this 11-year-old boy who had been the man of his house since he was 7, who had sat in this room tonight and trusted me with the most important thing he had. "Yes," I said. "I can find out." My father's land office was 2 rooms above the hardware store on the east side of Main Street. He had kept it organized with the particular system of a man who had worked alone for 30 years, which meant it was organized in a way that made complete sense to him and required translation for anyone else. I had been working through his papers since he died. It was the thing that kept me steady, when steady was hard to come by. On a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after I had first sat down in the dust of Main Street, I found the letter. It was inside a deed folder for a property on the county's western edge. My father's handwriting on the envelope, Clifton Marsh's name, a date 8 months before our engagement. I read it twice. Then I set it flat on the desk and looked at it the way my father taught me to look at a survey notation that was telling me something I had not expected. Carefully, without flinching. My father had written to Clifton about me, not as a father writing to a suitor, as a man writing to a business partner. The letter referenced my medical situation, not as a confession, not as something hidden, but as a disclosure, a condition of an arrangement. He was transferring certain land rights upon his death. Clifton was agreeing to take a wife. Both men knew what the exchange involved. The land transfer had not completed. My father had died before signing the final papers. I sat with that for a long time. Clifton had known from the beginning, before he took me to Sunday dinner at his mother's house, before he told me I was the most capable woman he had ever known, before he got down on one knee in my father's land office and put a ring on my finger while I thought, for the first time in a long time, that I had found my place in the world. He had known. My condition was not news to him. It was not the reason he ended the engagement. It was the excuse he used when the reason, the land, had already slipped away. My father had arranged it. He had been dying, and he had tried in his careful and practical way to make sure I would be taken care of. He had used what he had. What he had was land and a daughter, and he had packaged them together and handed them to a man he trusted. He had not told me. I think he believed he was protecting me. I think he believed Clifton would become in time what a husband ought to be, regardless of how it started. My father believed in the power of practical arrangements to become genuine ones. He was wrong about that. But he loved me. I had to hold those 2 things at the same time and not let one erase the other. I put the letter in my coat pocket. I walked out of the office and down the stairs and into the heat of Main Street. I walked west without deciding to. I was at the Holt Ranch gate before I recognized where my feet had taken me. Lily was on the fence post. She saw me, climbed down, took my hand. I let myself be led. Agnes put coffee in front of me. She looked at my face once, thoroughly, and did not ask. Jesse came in from the yard and stopped when he saw me. That brief, complete stop. I reached into my coat pocket. I put the letter on the kitchen table. I said, "I need to tell you something about Clifton Marsh." Jesse sat down across from me. He did not reach for the letter. He waited. I told him. All of it. My voice was level. I was proud of that. When I finished, the kitchen was quiet for a moment. Jesse said, "Your father didn't know what Clifton was." "He thought he knew," I said. "He was wrong. That's not the same thing as betraying you." I looked at him. "No," I said after a moment, "it isn't." He was quiet. Then, "What do you want to do with this?" The question surprised me. Not what should be done. What did I want? As though my preference in the matter was the relevant factor. "I want to understand what Clifton is doing now," I said, "because he is not finished. Men like that are never finished when there's still something to gain." Jesse nodded slowly. "He's been talking in town, I've heard it. About me. Careful language. Nothing you could call him on directly." I thought about this. About what Clifton was building and why, and toward what end. And I thought about what Noah had told me 3 nights ago in the blue curtain room. "Jesse," I said, "how well do you know Dorian Voss?" His face changed, not dramatically, just a shift in the quality of his stillness. "Well enough," he said. "He's been buying up every parcel on the river for 2 years," I said. "Your neighbor to the north sold to him in April. The Watkins property to the south is in negotiation." "I know. If he gets the Watkins land, he controls the only road access to the county seat. He can file an easement challenge on your deed and tie it up in county court for 2 years minimum." I held his gaze. "He's not interested in your land because it borders his. He's interested in your land because of the water. Your 1869 survey notation covers the only year-round water source on this side of the valley." Jesse looked at the map between us. "You got all this from the records." "My father surveyed this entire county for 16 years. I grew up reading these maps the way other children read storybooks." Something shifted in his face, a reassessment happening in real time. "How long has Voss been pushing?" I asked. "Since before Clara died," he said. The kitchen went quiet in a different way. I waited. "She passed 4 years ago," he said. "Riding accident." He was looking at the map, not at me. "Lily was 2. She hasn't spoken since." He said it the way a man says a thing he has said many times, so many times the words have worn smooth. But underneath the worn smooth surface was something that had not smoothed at all. I thought about what Noah had told me, about Lily's drawing, about Agnes and the color leaving her face. I said, "Jesse, I need to look into something. About the night Clara died." He looked up at me then, fully. "What do you know?" he said. "Not enough yet. Let me find out what I can before I tell you more. I don't want to say things I can't support." He studied me for a long moment with the particular quality of attention he gave to things he was deciding whether to trust. Then he said, "All right." That one word from this man meant more than he probably understood. Sheriff Walt Greer had been the law in Sulphur Creek for 22 years. He was 61 years old and built like a fence post, lean and weathered and unlikely to move in a wind. He had an office on the north side of the courthouse square with one window that faced the street and a desk that faced the door. And he sat behind that desk like a man who had nowhere else to be and no particular urgency about anything. He was the most deliberately unhurried man I had ever met. I would come to understand that this was not laziness. It was the particular patience of a man who had seen enough human behavior to know that most situations clarified themselves if you gave them sufficient time. I went to see him on a Wednesday morning, 3 days after my conversation with Jesse about Clara. I sat in the chair across from his desk. I told him what I had, what Noah had shared with me, what Lily's drawings suggested, the timeline of Voss's land purchases around the Holt property. Greer listened. He did not take notes. He did not interrupt. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I can't tell you what I can't prove." I said, "I understand that." He looked at me steadily. Then he stood up. He said he needed to step outside for 5 minutes. He said there was coffee on the stove if I wanted it. He left his desk drawer open. I looked at the open drawer, then I looked at the door. Then I looked at the open drawer again. Inside the drawer was a folder. Inside the folder was a single sheet of paper covered in handwriting I would come to recognize as Greer's own, small and precise and slanting slightly to the left. I read it. It was a record of an investigation, 4 years old. The conclusion written at the bottom in the same small, precise hand. Clara Holt's horse showed signs of deliberate provocation. The animal's behavior at the time of the accident was inconsistent with natural causes. No physical evidence sufficient to establish human agency. No witnesses who would come forward. Investigation closed. I read it twice. I put it back exactly as I had found it. I sat down. I put my hands in my lap. Greer came back in. He sat down behind his desk. He poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove. He looked at me. "Your father was a good man," he said. "Honest work. He didn't cut corners." "No," I said, "he didn't." "Funny thing about corners," Greer said. "Cut enough of them and eventually the whole structure goes crooked." He was not talking about survey work. I said, "I need to talk to Agnes Pruitt." Greer looked at his coffee cup. "Agnes Pruitt is a woman who has lived with something heavy for a long time. A person in that situation might need to know that what they say will go somewhere that matters." "It will," I said. He nodded once. The same kind of nod Jesse used. The kind that meant the matter was recorded and would be kept. I found Agnes in the kitchen garden that afternoon, cutting back the herbs that had gone leggy in the heat. She heard me come through the gate and did not look up. I sat on the garden bench. I did not speak for a moment. Then I said, "Agnes, I went to see Sheriff Greer this morning." Her hands stilled on the herb stems. She did not look up. "He has a folder in his desk drawer," I said. "He's had it for 4 years." Agnes set down her cutting shears. She sat down on the bench beside me. She looked at her hands in her lap for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was even. She had been rehearsing this, I realized, for 4 years. "I was in the yard that evening," she said. "Late, after supper. The children were in bed. Jesse was on the north pasture. He'd said he'd be back by dark, but it was running late." She stopped. "I went to check on the horses. The stable door was open. There were 2 men in there. Men I didn't know, except I knew who they worked for because I'd seen them ride in with Voss when he came to make his offer in the spring." She stopped again. "What were they doing?" I asked. "One of them was at Clara's mare. I didn't understand what he was doing, not then. I thought maybe they'd lost a horse and were looking in the wrong stable." She pressed her lips together. "I didn't go in. I went back to the house. I thought I would tell Jesse when he got back. But Clara had already gone out. She'd taken the mare out 20 minutes before." "I didn't know that. Not until Jesse came back and found the horse standing in the road alone." The garden was very quiet. "You didn't come forward," I said. "No." The word was simple. No defense inside it. I told myself I wasn't certain. I told myself I hadn't understood what I was seeing. I told myself if I came forward against a man like Voss with nothing but what I'd half seen from 20 yards in bad light, I would make things worse for Jesse and the children and accomplish nothing. A pause. Those things were all true. They were also not the whole truth. What was the rest of it? She looked at me. I was afraid. Voss had money and reach, and I was a housekeeper on a ranch that was barely keeping its head above water. I had 2 grieving children to look after and a man who was drowning. I made the choice that felt like survival. She looked back at her hands. I have not slept a full night since. I sat beside her for a moment. Then I said, Agnes, I need you to tell Jessie. She closed her eyes briefly. I know. Not today, but soon. Before we go to Greer officially. Jessie needs to hear it from you. She nodded, then quietly. Clara knew Voss was coming for the land. She had gone to the stable to ride out to his property herself that evening, to speak to him directly, without telling Jessie. I went still. She was trying to protect him, Agnes said. She thought if she could talk to Voss herself, settle it, Jessie wouldn't have to. She was brave that way. A little past careful, as Jessie used to say. She paused. She didn't tell him, because she knew he would try to stop her. The garden held very still around us. He's blamed himself, I said. For being on the north pasture, for not being there. Yes. Because he doesn't know she went out on purpose. Yes. I stood up. I needed to move. I walked to the garden gate and back. We're going to fix this, I said. Not just for the land. All of it. Agnes looked up at me. Something in her face shifted. Not relief, not yet, but the first movement toward it. Your father would have liked you, she said. He would have said you read situations the way he read land. Straight to the true line. I thought about my father, about the letter in my coat pocket, about the ways we protect the people we love and the ways those protections go wrong. He would have said a lot of things, I said. He didn't always get to. That night I found Noah at the kitchen table after the others had gone to bed. He was sitting in the dark. I lit the lamp and sat across from him. I told him what Agnes had told me. Not all of it. The part that was his to know. His mother had not been careless. She had been brave. She had gone out that night on purpose to protect his father. And something had happened that was not her fault, and not his father's fault, and not anyone's fault in this family. Noah listened. He was very still. When I finished, he looked at the lamp flame for a long time. Papa thinks he should have been there, he said. I know. He's thought that for 4 years. I know. We're going to fix that. Noah looked at me. In the lamplight, his face was young in a way it usually wasn't. 11 years old, the age a boy ought to be without the weight he'd been carrying since he was 7. How? He said. We tell the truth, I said. To the right people in the right order with enough evidence that it holds. He was quiet. Then, can you do that? Yes. He believed me. I could see it happen. The specific moment when a child decides to trust an adult is visible if you are watching for it. A small shift in the shoulders, a breath taken differently. All right, he said. He stood up. He put his hand briefly on the table between us, not touching my hand. Just there, present. The gesture of a boy who did not yet know how to say what he meant and was trying anyway. Then he went to bed. I stayed at the table for a while longer. I thought about Lily, asleep in her room, who had been drawing the same figure for 4 years because she had seen something and had no words to tell anyone what it was. I thought about what it would take to give that child her words back. A fast-moving storm came in off the flats on a Friday afternoon, the kind that turns the sky green and makes the cattle uneasy and closes the road back to town in 20 minutes. Agnes prepared the blue curtain room without commentary. I sent Pete Granger's horse to the barn and hoped Pete would not be too put out about it. That evening, the 5 of us were in the kitchen, the storm rattling the windows, the lamp turned up against the early dark. Agnes made soup. Jesse told the story of his father building this ranch with $12, a borrowed plow, and a mule with opinions about Mondays. Lily sat in my lap as though she had always sat there, one hand absently touching the buttons on my sleeve. Noah, at some point during the telling, asked me a question about a survey notation he'd found in a box of his grandfather's papers. Small question, chosen. The first time he had directly asked me anything, I answered it seriously. He listened seriously. Jesse watched us from across the table with the not quite a smile that lived near the edge of his face and rarely made it all the way out. When the children were in bed, Jesse and I sat on the covered porch. The storm was settling into steady rain. The yard was dark, and the smell of wet earth was everywhere. "Tell me about your father's work," Jesse said. I looked at him. "You don't have to. I want to." So I told him. The real version, not the abbreviated version I gave people who asked politely. The long version, with the early mornings and the field notebooks and the way my father could look at a piece of land and tell you its entire history before he set foot on it. Jesse listened the way he did everything, fully, without redirecting to himself, without waiting for me to finish so he could speak. When I was done, he said, "He sounds like a man who paid attention to things most people walk past." That's exactly what he was. A pause. Then Jesse said quietly, "Clara was like that too. She noticed things, small things. The way a horse was standing, whether the beans were coming up on the south side first, if one of the children was holding something behind their eyes." He was looking at the rain. "I was on the north pasture," he said, "the night she died. I'd said I'd be back by dark." A pause. "I wasn't. I was 20 minutes late. And by the time I came back, the mare was in the road and—" He stopped. I have run those 20 minutes through my head 1,000 times. I thought about what Agnes had told me, about Clara saddling the mare deliberately with purpose to ride toward Voss's property. I wanted to tell him. I was not ready. I needed Agnes to be the one to tell him about Clara. It had to come from someone who had loved Clara, too. "Jesse," I said carefully, "what happened to Clara was not about 20 minutes. He looked at me. "I can't tell you all of it yet. I need a few more days. But I want you to hear this now, from me. Those 20 minutes are not what cost you Clara." He was very still. "Will you trust me on that for a few more days?" A long pause. The rain on the porch roof. Somewhere in the yard, a horse shifted in the barn. "Yes," he said. Then a moment later, something I was not prepared for. "Sarah." My name in his voice, not Miss Calloway. "About the other thing. What Clifton said." I waited. "Whatever that man decided about you because of what you are. That was his failure of imagination, not yours." I looked at my hands in my lap. "He looked at you and saw something missing," Jesse said. "I look at you and I see—" He stopped himself, looked at the rain. "I see someone who found a 40-year-old survey notation in 20 minutes and understood exactly what it meant." I did not say anything for a moment. Then I said, "That is possibly the most unusual compliment I have ever received." Something moved in his face. The almost smile pushed closer to actually being one. "I'm better at useful than I am at pretty," he said. "Good," I said. "So am I." Then he made his mistake. I have to tell this part honestly because it is part of who he is, which means it is part of this story. It was the following week. Clifton had been busy. I heard about it from 3 different people in town on 3 different days. Careful language, nothing actionable. Concern, expressed in the particular way that Clifton expressed concern, which was designed to sound like kindness while functioning as something else entirely. Jesse found me at the kitchen table one morning. He sat across from me. He was careful. He was trying to protect something and choosing the wrong instrument. "It might be better," he said, "for the children if you weren't here quite as often, until this land business is settled." The kitchen went quiet. He meant it to protect me. I understood that. He was trying to keep Clifton's carefully constructed insinuations from attaching to me, from giving people something to say. He was thinking about the children and what stories might follow them. He was doing what he thought was the right thing. It landed like the wrong thing, precisely and exactly the wrong thing. Because what I heard underneath the careful words was, "Your circumstances are inconvenient. The situation you are in makes things complicated for people I need to protect. Step back." I had heard that sentence before, from a leather chair behind a too large desk. I said, "Of course." I gathered my papers. I said goodbye to Agnes with a steadiness that cost me something I'm not sure I have priced correctly yet. I rode back to town. Jesse knew the moment he said it. I could tell, even as I was walking out, that the knowledge hit him before the door closed. He stood in the kitchen doorway and did not call me back. I spent 3 days in my father's office. I worked through survey records and told myself this was fine, that I had been in Sulphur Creek for months without the Holt Ranch, and I could continue to be. On the 3rd day, Lily's drawing appeared under the door of my office. Slipped through the gap. No note. Just the drawing of the road going west with an X through it. I picked it up. I sat down on the floor with my back against the desk and held it. The next morning, Jesse Holt knocked on the door of my father's office. He stood in the doorway. He did not have a speech prepared. His hat was in his hands. "I said the wrong thing," he said. I waited. "I said it because I was afraid of what Clifton would do with your reputation. And I put that above what was true. That was wrong." No qualification. No but. No explanation dressed as excuse. "It was the same thing he said to me," I said. In different words. Jesse absorbed that. Did not deflect. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." I looked at him standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, 4 miles from his ranch, having ridden into town to say 2 words that he meant without decoration. "All right," I said. He let out a breath, small, the breath of a man who had not been sure of the answer. "Come back," he said. "There are still papers to go through." "I know," I said. I was going to come back tomorrow anyway. Something moved in his face. "Were you?" "Yes, I had a plan about Voss. I was waiting until I was less irritated with you to explain it." The almost smile arrived, stayed longer than usual. "That's fair," he said. "I went to see Dorian Voss. I want to be honest about this. I made this decision alone, without telling Jesse or Agnes or anyone. My reasoning was that I could read people the way I read survey maps, which is to say I could identify where the language broke down, where the stated claim did not match the underlying record. And I thought if I could see Voss directly, observe his reaction to certain information, I might find something Greer could use. That was my reasoning. It was good reasoning as far as it went. What it missed was that Voss was also reading me. He received me in the parlor of his main house, which was the largest house in the county, and had been built to make sure you knew that. He was 52 years old, with white at his temples, and the kind of groomed stillness that costs money to maintain. He offered me coffee. He inquired about my father's work with what appeared to be genuine interest. Then, in the course of 3 minutes of polished conversation, he mentioned my father's name, his specific projects, dates, and locations, and the names of specific county clerks he had worked with. Details no one would know without research. He was telling me, without saying it, that he had studied me, that I had been a variable in his calculations before I was aware of any calculations. I left after 11 minutes. I rode back to the Holt Ranch. Jesse was at the gate. Someone in town had seen me ride to Voss's property and had told someone who had told Jesse. In a county this size, information moved faster than horses. He said, "You went to see him." Not a question. His voice was a register I had not heard from him before. Not loud. Something colder than loud. I thought I could... He killed my wife, Sarah. The words dropped between us like a stone into still water. I had not heard him say it plainly before. I think it was the first time he had said it plainly to anyone. I did not argue. I did not explain myself. He was right, and not only about Voss. You went alone, Jesse said, because you don't trust anyone else to see it through. Because you've been handling everything by yourself since your father died and you don't know how to stop. Don't tell me what I do. I'm not telling you. He was looking at me directly, no flinching in it. I'm asking you to let me stand beside you, instead of finding out after the fact that you walked into something dangerous. I'm asking you to let me be there. The yard was quiet. A horse stamped in the barn. The evening light was going gold. I thought about what he was actually asking. Not for control, not for deference. To be beside me. That was the specific word. Beside. He studied me, I said, before I ever went there. He'd researched my father's work, specific dates, specific clerks. He already knew I was involved in this. Jesse's jaw tightened. I know. He wasn't surprised to see me. He was entertained. I know. That means he's not worried about what I know, which means we need to move faster than he thinks we're moving. Jesse was quiet for a moment. Then, what do you need? Not what do we do. What do you need? Putting the next move with me. I need Agnes to tell you what she told me, I said. Tonight. About Clara. He went still. There's something you don't know about the night Clara died. Something that changes what you've been telling yourself for 4 years. I held his gaze. Agnes has to be the one to tell you. She was there. She saw something, and she kept it because she was afraid, and she has been carrying that ever since. Will you listen to her? A very long pause, the kind that has something alive in it. Yes, he said. I was in the kitchen with Noah and Lily during the conversation between Jesse and Agnes. I did not hear the words. I heard the quality of the silence afterward. Jesse came into the kitchen 40 minutes later. He poured himself coffee. He sat down. He looked older. Not in a bad way. In the way of a man who has just put down a weight he has been carrying for so long he had stopped noticing the shape of it. She went out on purpose, he said. Yes. She was trying to get to Voss before I found out he'd been coming around again. Yes, she was protecting you. He was quiet. Then very low. That sounds like her. I know it does. She was a little past careful, he said. It was the same thing Agnes had said. A phrase that belonged to him, that he had used for Clara, that Agnes had kept and returned to him now. Noah had gone very still across the table. He was looking at his father. Jesse looked at his son. Your mother went out that night on purpose, son. She wasn't careless. She was brave. Noah pressed his lips together. He nodded once. Then he looked at the table. I know, he said quietly. I think I always knew she wasn't careless. Jesse reached across the table and put his hand over Noah's. He left it there for a moment. Then he cleared his throat. We need to go to Greer, he said, with everything. Yes, I said. All of it. Agnes's testimony, Lily's drawings, the land timeline, the 1869 notation. We build the full record. When? Tomorrow morning, I said. Before Voss knows we're moving. Jesse looked at me across the table. Agnes was at the stove with her back to us, and I could see her shoulders, the set of them, different from what they had been 2 hours ago. A millstone lifted. Not gone. Lifted. Sarah, Jesse said. I looked at him. Thank you. Not elaborate, not dressed up. 2 words with everything he meant by them carried in the weight he gave them. You're welcome, I said. We went to Greer the next morning. All 3 of us. Jesse, Agnes, and me. Greer listened to Agnes for 45 minutes without interrupting. He asked her 4 questions at the end. Then he opened his desk drawer and put his 4-year-old folder on the desk between us. "I've been waiting for a witness," he said. "I have one now." He looked at Jesse. "This won't move fast. Men like Voss have lawyers, and those lawyers have delays, but this—" He tapped the folder. "This opens a door that doesn't close again." Jesse nodded. "What do we do now?" "You let me work," Greer said. "You go home and watch your property, and you don't go near Voss or anyone who works for him." He looked at me specifically. "Anyone." "Understood," I said. He held my gaze 1 beat longer to make sure. "Understood," I said again. Voss did not wait for us to act first. The letter came 4 days after our visit to Greer. It was delivered to the ranch by a rider I did not recognize in the late afternoon when Jesse was on the far end of the property. Agnes took it. She read it. She sent Noah to find me at the fence line where I was checking the survey markers against the 1869 notation. I read it standing up. It was from Voss's attorney. The language was careful and precise and entirely devastating. It stated that Mr. Voss had become aware of the considerable activity at the Holt property involving one Miss Sarah Calloway, and that he wished to raise, as a matter of community interest, certain questions about the propriety of an unmarried woman of Miss Calloway's particular circumstances residing at the property of a widowed man with young children. He intended to bring these concerns to the attention of the county family court magistrate, unless, of course, a satisfactory resolution to the current land matter could be reached. Particular circumstances. 2 words doing the work of everything Clifton had said in his leather chair, everything the women on Main Street had said while I was sitting in the dust, dressed up in the language of civic concern and pointed at the 2 people I least wanted it to touch. I read it twice. My hands did not shake. My hands did not gee. I was distantly proud of that. I folded it. I put it in my pocket. I finished checking the survey markers. Then I went inside. Jesse came in at dusk. I handed him the letter. He read it. His face moved through something controlled and rapid. Then he set it on the table. "He's going to the family court," he said. "Yes." "Using your—" "Yes." He was quiet. Then very low. "That he would use that. Write it in a legal document and send it to a courthouse." His voice carried something underneath the control. Something that was not anger at me, nothing near it, but a furious protectiveness that had no clean outlet. That he would write it down and send it. "He thinks it's my soft point," I said. "He's been looking for one since the first time he saw me here. He's wrong. I know that. He doesn't know it yet." Jesse looked at me. "The family court magistrate. His name is Fowler. Do you know him?" "I know of him. Good man, I think. Fair." He paused. "But Voss has money and lawyers and a letter that says things a magistrate has to at least consider." "Unless there's no basis to consider," I said. "Unless the situation he's describing doesn't exist." Jesse looked at me steadily. "The review is in 6 days," I said. "If we're married before the review, the foundation of his petition disappears. There's no impropriety. There's nothing to review." The kitchen was very quiet. "I know what this looks like," I said. "I know what I'm asking, and I know it isn't what either of us planned. I'm not asking you to do anything you don't want to do. I'm telling you what it does to his case." Jesse said, "You think I'm calculating whether I want to marry you. I think you should have more than 6 days to—" "Sarah." My name in his voice, quiet and complete. "I told you last week what I wanted. That hasn't changed because Voss found a new angle." He sat down across from me. He turned his coffee cup once on the table, slow and deliberate. "The question isn't whether I want this," he said. "The question is whether you want to do it this way, fast and practical, and not what most women—" "I have never in my life been what most women," I said. Something moved through his face. "No," he said, "you haven't." We looked at each other across the table. "Then ask me," I said. He held my gaze. And he asked me, plain and direct, in the language of a man who says what he means and means all of it. I said yes. Agnes was already standing up from the table when we looked at her. "I'll send Noah to fetch Reverend Mills in the morning," she said. "He owes me a favor from the Christmas supper situation." Jessie said, "What Christmas supper situation?" "Furniture, Jessie," Agnes said. "I'm furniture." And she went to start the planning. Lily appeared in the doorway. She had been on the stairs. She had heard everything. She came across the kitchen and climbed into my lap with the complete bodily commitment of a child who does not do things halfway. She pressed her face against my neck. Her arms went around me. She said, muffled into my shoulder, "You're staying." "I'm staying," I said. "Promise." "I promise." Jesse was standing in the kitchen doorway, watching his daughter hold on to me. His face was the open thing, the unguarded thing. 4 years of doing everything right and doing everything alone, visible for one moment in the set of his expression. Then he cleared his throat. "I need to go into town tomorrow," he said. "I want to speak to Fowler directly before he's formed any opinions based on Voss's paperwork." He looked at me. "I want you here. I want the children here and Agnes to know where everyone is." "One day," I said. "Then we handle the rest together." He nodded. He put his hat on. He stopped at the door, looked back. "For what it's worth," he said, "I've been glad you came back every time." I looked at him. "So have I." He went. Clifton Marsh came to see me the following morning at my father's office. I had wondered when he would. He sat in the chair across the desk from me, which was where I had once sat across from him. He was as polished as ever. He looked like a man who had made a decision he was not entirely comfortable with and was working hard not to let that show. "I've heard about Voss's letter," he said. "Have you?" "Sarah." He used my name with a familiarity that no longer fit. "Whatever you've gotten yourself into with Jesse Holt." "I have gotten myself into a survey dispute with a land baron, who I believe is responsible for the death of Jesse Holt's wife," I said pleasantly. "And I am going to make sure the correct people know the correct facts before the end of next week. Was there something else?" He looked at me. The practiced smoothness of his expression slipped slightly. "You should know that Voss has resources you don't." "I know that. And that his attorney is very good." "I imagine so." I looked at him steadily. "Clifton, are you warning me or threatening me?" He did not answer immediately, which was its own answer. I stood up. "I think we're finished," I said. "I think we've been finished for longer than either of us has acknowledged. You'll want to consider carefully which side of this you're standing on when it's over." He left. I sat back down. I thought about the letter he had written to my father. I thought about the ring I had put in my coat pocket the morning after Clifton ended the engagement, and how I still had not thrown it away, how I had been carrying it like penance for something I had not done. I put my hand in my coat pocket. The ring was there, small and cool against my fingers. I left it there for now. There would be a time for it. Jesse came back from town that afternoon with the particular steadiness of a man who has done something hard and done it correctly. He sat down. He drank half his coffee. Then he said, Fowler listened. He asked good questions. He looked at the deed, the 1869 notation, the full filing. A pause. He also told me he'd received a visit from his wife that morning. Silence. Agnes at the stove became very focused on the soup. Jesse said, Martha Lee. You sent a note to the magistrate's wife. Constance Fowler is a reasonable woman, Agnes said serenely. She had a brother who lost a land claim to Voss in 1879. I simply made sure she had the same information her husband did before he formed any opinions. Jesse stared at her. Furniture, Agnes said. Pure furniture. Noah found me on the porch that evening. He'd been quieter than usual since the conversation about Clara, and I had not pushed. Some things needed space to settle before they could be spoken. He sat on the porch step. He looked at the yard. I knew something was wrong, he said. That night, I was 7, but I knew. I heard the mare come back without her. I heard Agnes in the yard. I understood something bad had happened before Papa came home. I sat beside him. I did not speak. For a long time, I thought if I'd been older, I would have known what to do. He turned his hat over in his hands. I used to think about what I should have done differently. You were 7, I said. I know, but that's what I thought. I looked at him. This boy, 11 years old and carrying the guilt of a child who witnessed something terrible and did not know how to stop it. Noah, you were 7 years old. The only thing you were supposed to do at 7 was be 7. That is the complete list of responsibilities. He looked at me. His expression said he had heard this before and had not yet found a way to believe it. Your father stood on the north pasture 20 minutes late, I said, and blamed himself for it for 4 years. You sat in a house at 7 years old and blamed yourself for the same amount of time. You were both wrong about the same thing for the same wrong reasons. He was quiet. The person responsible for what happened to your mother, I said, is Dorian Voss. Not you, not your father, not the 20 minutes or the 7 years old. Voss. Noah looked at the yard. The evening was settling into the long gold light that came before dark. I know, he said finally. I know that. But knowing and feeling are different things. Yes. You can know the right answer and still feel the wrong one for a while. That's not weakness. That's just how it works. He turned the hat over again. Then he put it on his knee and left it there. She was good, he said. My mother. She was really good. I know she was. I can see it in you and Lily. His shoulders dropped. One small degree. The specific relaxation of a boy who has been holding himself at attention for a very long time. After a while, he said, I'm glad you're marrying Papa. I looked at him. He's better when you're here, Noah said, with the plain matter-of-factness of a child who says true things without decoration. He laughs more. He talks more. He paused, thinking about how to say it. He seems like he's here instead of somewhere else. I said, he's a good man. I know. He's the best man I know. Noah looked at me sideways. Don't tell him I said that. He'll be insufferable. I bit back a smile. Our secret. He nodded seriously, extended his hand. We shook on it. It was the most grown-up thing and the most childlike thing I had ever witnessed simultaneously. I filed it somewhere warm. That night, after the children were in bed, Jessie and I sat in the kitchen. The house was quiet. Agnes had gone to her room an hour before, and the particular silence of a house at rest had settled around us. Jessie said, Voss came to the front door this afternoon while I was in town. I went still. What? Agnes and the children were here. He came to the front door. Knocked like he was calling on neighbors. What did he say? Agnes answered. He looked around her into the house. He asked after Miss Calloway. Jessie's voice was even, but the control in it was deliberate. He used your name. He said he hoped you were keeping well. I understood what that meant. He had come to look, to assess the situation, to let us know that he was aware of the details of our household. He mentioned Clara, Jessie said. I looked at him. Not directly. He said the house looked well kept. He said Clara Holt had a good eye for a home. His jaw tightened briefly. He used her name. The casual cruelty of it, using Clara's name like a prop, a reminder that he had been there, that he knew what had happened. He wanted you to know he isn't rattled, I said. I know. He's wrong. Jessie looked at me. Yes, he said. He is. We sat in the quiet for a moment. Then Jesse said, "The ceremony is Saturday morning. Reverend Mills confirmed." "All right." "Agnes is making biscuits." A pause. "She says the occasion requires biscuits." "She's right. She usually is." He looked at his hands on the table. "I'm not good at ceremonies. I want you to know that. I'm going to say the words and mean them, and I may not do it in a way that looks... Jesse." I waited until he looked at me. "I don't need a ceremony. I need you to mean it." "I mean it." "Then we're fine." He held my gaze for a long moment. Then, Saturday. Saturday. The wedding was Saturday morning in the kitchen. Agnes wore her good dress and stood straight-backed with the expression of a woman experiencing profound satisfaction and choosing dignity as its display. Noah wore a string tie that Jesse helped him knot, standing in front of the hallway mirror together with the concentrated gravity of two people who have found themselves doing something ceremonial and intend to honor it. Lily had been up before dawn. She had gone to the south fence line and cut yellow wildflowers and put them in a mason jar on the kitchen table, adjusting the arrangement twice before deciding it was finished. Reverend Mills arrived at 9. He had been fully briefed by Agnes and arrived with the bearing of a man who knows exactly what he's doing and why it matters. Jesse stood across from me in the kitchen and looked at me the way he looked at things he intended to keep. Directly. Without apology. Without the careful management he applied to most things. The Reverend spoke the words. When it came to Jesse's part, he said it the way he said everything that mattered to him. "I do." Plain. Complete. I said my words. My voice held. I was proud of that. The Reverend closed his book. Lily stepped in front of me. She looked up. She said one word. "Mama." Not a question, not a test. A statement of the plainest fact, delivered by a child who had decided something at a fence gate months ago and had been patiently waiting for the world to catch up. The word moved through me like a key in a lock, all the way down. Past the doctor's office and the leather chair in the middle of Main Street, and the ring in my pocket that I had been carrying like penance. I knelt down. I took her face in my hands. She was 6 years old with enormous eyes and hair that would never quite cooperate, and she was looking at me with the absolute certainty of someone who has made a decision and does not expect to revisit it. "Yeah," I said. My voice was barely there. "Yeah, baby, I'm right here." She went forward. I caught her. I held her. Noah took one step, then another. The deliberate, considered movement of a boy who gives his trust carefully and was giving it now. His arms went around both of us. Jesse crossed the room and put one hand on Noah's shoulder and his other arm around me. Agnes looked at the ceiling. The Reverend studied his boots. Nobody said a word. Nobody needed to. 3 days later, Magistrate Fowler's hearing convened on the Voss matter. The courtroom was not large. The county courthouse had been built for practical purposes by practical people, and it showed. 2 long benches for observers, a raised desk for the magistrate, a table on each side. Voss sat at his table with his attorney from Austin, a thin man named Garrett, who had the polished confidence of someone accustomed to winning on procedure. Clifton Marsh sat beside them. He did not look at me when I came in. I sat at our table with Jesse and Agnes. Greer sat in the observer's bench with his folder. Noah and Lily sat in the back row with a neighbor woman who had offered to stay with them. This had been agreed upon. This had been clearly established. Lily had her drawing notebook. Garrett opened on the land question. He was good. He used the boundary language precisely, cited 3 county filings in sequence, and presented Voss's claim to the access corridor with the smooth efficiency of a man who had read these documents many times. I presented our response, the 1869 notation, the chain of title, the watershed language that predated Voss's earliest purchase by 11 years. I spoke in the precise, unhurried language my father had taught me, not arguing, explaining. Fowler asked two clarifying questions. He had read the record. He was not going to be fooled by procedure. Then Garrett moved to the second matter, the welfare petition. He was careful. He used careful words. He spoke of the well-being of two young children, of the unsuitable nature of certain arrangements, of the particular circumstances of the woman currently residing at the Holt property. Particular circumstances. I heard it land in the room. I watched Fowler's face. He was neutral. He was listening. Garrett said that Clara Holt had been, by all accounts, a woman of impeccable character, and that the children deserved a home that honored that legacy, rather than one that... He did not finish the sentence. He did not finish it because Lily had stood up. Agnes reached for her. Lily stepped forward, out of reach, and walked to the center of the aisle between the benches. She was 6 years old, and the room was enormous, and she did not appear to notice either of these things. She had her drawing notebook held against her chest. She did not look at Garrett. She looked at Voss. Then she looked at Magistrate Fowler, and she spoke. Her voice was small, each word placed with the care of a child who has been saving them up for a long time and intends to spend them correctly. I saw him. She pointed at Voss. Her arm was steady. I saw that man and another man at our stable the night my mama died. They were next to her horse. The room did not breathe. He was there. She did not lower her arm. I saw him. She opened her drawing notebook. She held up the page with the figure in the darkness beside the horse that she had drawn over and over for 4 years. I drew it, she said, so I wouldn't forget. Fowler looked at the drawing. He looked at Lily. He looked at Voss. Voss's face was the controlled face of a man who has calculated many situations and is calculating this one. But underneath the calculation, something else, something that had not been there before. Greer stood up. He walked to the front of the room and placed his folder on Fowler's desk. I've had this for 4 years, he said. I've been waiting for a witness with standing to come forward. I have one. Fowler looked at the folder, opened it, read. The room waited. This proceeding is adjourned pending criminal investigation into the death of Clara Holt, Fowler said. The land petition is ruled in favor of the Holt claim, based on the 1869 survey notation establishing prior right to the water access corridor. He looked at Garrett. Your client's easement argument has no basis in the recorded chain of title. He looked at Voss. You will want to speak to your attorney, he said, about matters other than land. Jesse crossed the courtroom in 10 steps and knelt in front of Lily. He held her face in both hands. Lily. She looked at him. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, Papa, the clearest sentence she had spoken in 4 years. She was my mama. He pulled her in, held her. His shoulders moved once. I stood across the room. Noah came to stand beside me. He put his hand briefly on my arm. He did not speak. He did not need to. Clifton Marsh tried to leave without looking at me. He did not manage it. We were at the same door. He stopped. He looked at me with the expression of a man who knows he has been found out and is deciding whether to address it. Sarah, he said. Clifton. I looked at him calmly, fully, the way my father had taught me to look at a piece of land that was misrepresenting itself. I want you to know I'm not angry at you. He seemed surprised, as though he'd been braced for something else. I'm not angry because I don't think about you anymore. What you did, the way you used my father's paperwork and my medical history in 6 months of Sunday dinners, I think you'll carry that longer than I will. He did not respond. I did not need him to. I walked past him into the sunlight. Voss was arrested 3 weeks later. Greer had been thorough. The evidence, Agnes's testimony and Lily's drawings and the physical record from the stable, built a case that Voss's attorneys could delay but could not dismiss. He was held pending trial. Clifton Marsh left Sulphur Creek quietly on a Tuesday without telling anyone. Pete Granger mentioned it to me in passing. His horse was gone from the stable, his office locked. I sat with that information for approximately 40 seconds. Then I went back to what I was doing. He had already become irrelevant to me. That was the only justice I needed. Not satisfaction, not relief. Just the clean emptiness of a thing that no longer had any claim on my attention. The week after the hearing was the quietest week I could remember. Lily added words the way a fire adds heat, slowly, steadily, until the warmth was simply there and you stopped noticing the absence of cold. 3 words on Tuesday. A full sentence Thursday about whether General the Cat was allowed on the supper table, which he was not, which she disputed with considerable passion. By Saturday, she had opinions about everything and expressed them without apology. The first morning, she said my name across the kitchen table, casual and mid-sentence. Passing me the butter as though she had been doing it for years, I had to turn toward the window. I was not going to let a 6-year-old see me cry over butter. Noah asked me to show him how to read a survey map. We spent 2 afternoons at the kitchen table with my father's notebook spread between us, and he learned faster than I expected, which I should have expected because he was his father's son, and his father never had to be told anything twice. Agnes and I sat on the porch one evening with nothing particular to do. She wrapped her hands around her cup and was quiet for a while. I kept that secret because I thought silence was the same as protection, she said. It isn't, I said. No, you didn't stay silent. I didn't have anything left to protect. She looked at me over her cup. You had plenty to protect. You chose not to, anyway. A pause. There's a difference. I had good teachers, I said. She made the small sound she made when she was acknowledging something she did not intend to be moved by. We drank our coffee and watched the evening come in over the flats, and it was the most comfortable I'd been sitting still in longer than I could accurately recall. Jesse made coffee badly. He had been making it badly his entire adult life and showed no signs of improvement or concern about this. I found it charming in a way I was not ready to confess to him, because if he knew he would stop, out of some misguided sense of correcting a deficiency, and I did not want it corrected. He told a story about a calf that had escaped into Agnes's kitchen 3 winters ago and eaten half her herb garden before being cornered against the stove. He told it completely straight-faced, which made it worse, and I laughed the genuine kind that gets away from you before you decide to let it happen. When I caught my breath, I found him watching me with the expression that had started as an almost smile, and had, somewhere in the past weeks, become an actual one, real and unhurried, and entirely unguarded. You're going to be insufferable about making me laugh, I said. Probably, he agreed. I am going to be in serious trouble, I thought. I am already in serious trouble. I have been in serious trouble since a little girl held my hand at a fence gate and led me toward something I did not know I had been walking toward my entire life. On Saturday morning, I found Jesse in the kitchen early, looking at the survey map we had filed with the county. It was a plain piece of paper, bureaucratic, unremarkable to look at. It was also the record that had made Voss's claim unworkable. Thinking about your father? I asked. And mine, he said. He looked up. They would have liked each other. They would have argued about the 1869 notation for an hour, I said, and then agreed about it and drunk coffee and argued again. He smiled, the full one. Probably. I sat down across from him. The morning was quiet. The children were still asleep. Agnes's fire was going, and the kitchen was warm, and the red dust of Sulphur Creek had not yet begun to move in the early breeze. Jesse said, I want to tell you something I don't say to people. I waited. When Clara died, I thought the hardest thing was going to be learning how to be alone with the grief. He turned his coffee cup. It wasn't. The hardest thing was learning how to be present when I had to be. For the children. For the work. To keep showing up when showing up felt like something that cost more than I had. He looked at me. You showed up in the dust in the middle of Main Street, he said, and you didn't pretend you were somewhere else. You sat in the actual place you were, in the actual moment you were in it, and you didn't perform being fine." He paused. "I recognize that. I have not stopped recognizing it." I looked at this man across my kitchen table, at the lines in his face that had been put there by honest weather and honest work, and 4 years of doing everything right and doing it alone, at the steadiness in him that was not distance, not armor, just the particular stillness of a person who has learned to be where they are. "Jesse," I said. "I know," he said. "I know we said what we said at the ceremony. I just wanted you to know that." I put my hand on the table between us. He put his over it. His grip was warm and deliberate and did not let go. That afternoon I took the ring from my coat pocket. I had carried it since the morning after Clifton ended the engagement. Through the summer and the red dust and the 4 miles of road west and the map tables and the courtroom. I had told myself I was carrying it as evidence of something, or as a reminder, or as penance. I was not sure which. I stood at the fence line at the edge of the south yard. The grass was dry and gold in the afternoon light. Jessie was in the barn. The children were somewhere with Agnes. The land stretched out wide and quiet in every direction. I opened my hand. The ring sat in my palm, small, plain, belonging to a version of my life that no longer existed. I set it in the dry grass on the other side of the fence. I looked at it there for one moment. Then I turned around and did not look at it again. That evening, supper done, the children in the hallway arguing good-naturedly about something I could not hear clearly, Agnes's lamp going dark in her room, Jessie and I at the sink, he washed, I dried. The domestic plainness of it, 2 people in a kitchen at the end of a day, was so ordinary and so exactly right that it nearly undid me. "Any regrets?" he asked. I looked out the window at the dark land. The land we had mapped and filed and defended. Ours. "Clifton Marsh once told me I wasn't enough to be a wife," I said. I handed him the last dish. It turns out he was right. I wasn't enough to be his wife. Jesse set the dish down. He turned to look at me. "I am exactly enough to be yours," I said. He took my hand. Both of them. The grip of a man who has decided and does not intend to undecide. From down the hall, "Sarah," Lily's voice, bright and carrying. "Will you come tell me something?" Noah. "She doesn't need someone to tell her things." Lily. "You don't. I do." Jesse and I looked at each other. He tilted his head toward the hallway. I went. The hallway was dark except for the small lamp in Lily's room. She was in bed with the covers pulled to her chin and General the cat arranged proprietorially at her feet, which was not where cats were supposed to be on beds, but was where he was regardless. She looked up at me when I came to the doorway. "Will you sit?" she said. I sat on the edge of her bed. She shifted to make room with the unconscious generosity of a child who shares space without calculating the cost. "What would you like me to tell you?" I asked. She thought about this seriously. "Tell me something about your papa," she said. I looked at her. Her dark eyes, Jesse's eyes, looking back at me with complete and uncomplicated expectation. I thought about my father, about field notebooks and transit levels and 30 years of walking property lines, about a man who believed that land does not lie about what it is, and that if you know the right words, you can read the true line in anything. My father used to say, I told her, that maps tell you where you are, but it's the people who tell you where you belong. Lily considered this. "I think that's right," she said, with the confidence of someone making an expert assessment. "I think so, too." She reached out and tucked her hand into mine. Small fingers, certain grip. "You belong here," she said. Not asking, telling, the way she did everything that mattered. "I know," I said. "I think I always did." I just had to find the right road. She closed her eyes. General repositioned himself against her feet. The lamp burned low. I sat there until her breathing went deep and even, until the small hand in mine went loose with sleep. Then I stood, careful and quiet, and walked back down the hall. Jesse was in the kitchen doorway, waiting. He had heard, I thought, or some of it. He had the look of a man who has received something he was not expecting and is not sure what to do with the size of it. I walked to him. He moved aside, and I passed through the doorway into the kitchen, and he followed and closed the door to the hall softly so as not to wake the children. We stood in the kitchen in the lamplight. The house breathed around us, the particular breath of a house that holds people who belong to each other. My father used to say, I said quietly, that land records tell stories. You just have to know which words to listen for. Jesse looked at me. What story does this one tell? I thought about the road from Main Street, about 4 miles and a cup of coffee and a little girl who had sat down beside a stranger and decided. About survey maps and family court and a stable in the dark, and an old man with a folder in his drawer waiting for a witness. About a boy who stopped pretending to be grown, and a girl who started speaking again, and a man who had stopped on a road when he didn't have to. About a woman who had sat in the dust and not known where she was going. Who knew now? This one, I said, tells the story of where I was going all along. Jesse reached out. He tucked a strand of hair back from my face, careful and deliberate, the way he did everything that mattered. Home, he said. Home, I agreed. From down the hall, the house was quiet. Outside, the Texas night spread wide and dark over land that was ours. Every surveyed inch of it, recorded and filed and true. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I had always been going here. I just hadn't known it until I sat down in the dust. This work of fiction is a product of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events, or locales, is purely coincidental. The narrative is intended solely for artistic and entertainment purposes, and should not be interpreted as a reflection of real individuals or factual occurrences.
Good afternoon, everyone. This story is, at its heart, a deeply human Western about loss, dignity, truth, and the long road toward belonging. On the surface, it gives us the familiar elements of frontier life: land disputes, courtroom justice, harsh reputations, quiet ranch houses, and people tested by hardship. But underneath all that, it tells a more intimate story. The story of wounded people finding healing not through grand speeches, but through steady kindness, courage, and truth. The first major meaning of this story is that a person's worth is not defined by what society says they lack. Sarah is rejected by Clifton because she is seen as unable to fulfill one narrow expectation of womanhood, motherhood by blood. That rejection wounds her deeply, not only because of the broken engagement, but because it attacks her identity. Yet the story patiently proves that Clifton was blind. He measured a woman by function, by social usefulness, by what could be gained from her. Jessie, in contrast, sees Sarah for who she truly is: intelligent, brave, capable, morally steady, and deeply loving. The story teaches us that the world often misjudges people according to shallow standards, but real love sees the whole person. A second important meaning is that kindness can be life-changing when it preserves someone's dignity. Jesse's first act is small, but unforgettable. He does not humiliate Sarah, question her, or rush to rescue her in a way that turns her pain into a spectacle. He simply asks whether she needs a hand up or a minute. That moment defines the moral center of the entire story. True compassion is not control. It is not pity. It is not showing off goodness in public. True compassion gives another person room to remain human in their worst moment. In a hard world, gentleness becomes a kind of moral strength. The story also teaches that family is not built by blood alone, but by loyalty, truth, and chosen love. Sarah has been told she cannot be a full wife because she cannot bear children. Yet she becomes exactly what Lily and Noah need: safety, wisdom, tenderness, and presence. Lily's final acceptance of Sarah as Mama is one of the most powerful moments in the story because it destroys the lie that motherhood is only biological. This story reminds us that love is proven in constancy, in care, in showing up day after day. Home is not merely where one is born. Home is where one is received, needed, trusted, and loved. Another major lesson is that silence may feel like protection, but truth is what truly sets people free. For years, Agnes, Noah, Jesse, and Lily all live under the weight of silence surrounding Clara's death. Each person carries guilt in a different form. Agnes stays quiet out of fear. Jesse blames himself for being late. Noah blames himself for being too young. Lily holds the truth in drawings because she has no words. The story shows how silence can preserve suffering, even when it is meant to prevent harm. Healing begins only when truth is spoken, carefully, bravely, and at the right time. This is a powerful moral lesson. Truth may be painful, but lies and silence imprison the innocent far longer. The Western setting also strengthens another timeless lesson. Justice does not always come quickly, but it requires courage, evidence, and persistence. This is not a story where evil falls in one dramatic moment. Dorian Voss is powerful, wealthy, and manipulative. To confront such a man, the characters must gather facts, trust one another, and keep moving forward even while afraid. In that sense, the story honors ordinary courage. It tells us that bravery is not only in gunfights or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes bravery is in telling what you saw, in testifying, in returning after you have been hurt, in standing beside someone instead of turning away. Perhaps the most beautiful lesson of all is this: broken roads can still lead us home. Sarah's humiliation in the dust of Main Street feels like the end of her life as she imagined it. But that moment of collapse becomes the beginning of grace. Her pain leads her west, toward the Holt Ranch, toward Lily and Noah, toward Jesse, and ultimately toward the life that was truly meant for her. The story does not romanticize suffering, but it does show that God, fate, or life itself can draw meaning out of heartbreak. What seemed like rejection becomes redirection. What seemed like ruin becomes belonging. In conclusion, this story tells us that dignity matters, truth heals, love is chosen through action, and a person is far more than the wound others use to define them. It reminds us that the best people are not always the loudest or the most polished, but the ones who stay, who tell the truth, who protect without possessing, and who make a place where others can finally rest. This is why the story lingers in the heart. It is not only about justice won or evil exposed, it is about